Hey guys, so we're gonna go over hands in this video. I want to basically address what I think about what kind of information I'm distilling down from what I'm actually seeing, and a general kind of thought process moving through the development of a drawing of hands. So probably the first couple things I want to mention here. Hands, probably can't even see that, but there's some things that you want to avoid when drawing hands. And one of those things is probably the most important thing to avoid when you're drawing hands is to actually draw the contour of each of the hands. You really want to try to avoid as best you can of putting that kind of information into a hand drawing. It's something that we tend to, if that's what we're seeing, we tend to kind of develop that area too quickly. It becomes very generalized and very kind of symbolic looking. So avoid hand contours. Sorry, more specifically, finger contours. And avoid, I guess it's kind of like drawing each of the knuckles very symmetrically. So like thinking of the pointer finger as like this kind of like sausage link type of thing here. So we want to avoid that. We want to avoid the knuckles becoming sausage links. For lack of a better kind of expression of that. So those are the things that first and foremost I'm avoiding. If I'm seeing them, I'm trying to design those out of what I'm seeing. So if I have something like this, I still want to think, of this more of this relationship from here to here than I do from just drawing kind of this whole contour. And then, for instance, the knuckle relationships like this. So the things that I'm thinking of, A is what's happening as it's coming out of the wrist kind of joint here. So in the arms week, we kind of ended with that 2x4 wrist connection point. So now it's when we're going to pick up at that same spot and kind of draw the hand out of that. So starting with 2x4 wrist. I'm thinking mostly about the planes and the big picture. Okay, so planes being like side plane, top plane. The thumb area has kind of this like 45-degree angle kind of plane to it. Bottom plane right here. And then there's also a front plane. So thinking about the fingers tips as more of a front plane than anything else. And then the last plane that is probably most overlooked is actually the front plane between the fingers. And that plane is at more of an angle here. So plane, plane, side plane, top plane, bottom plane. All of this coming out of our kind of wrist 2x4 planes. The other nice thing about hands, so here let me put planes, is we have one that we can always be drawing and studying from, and we can actually look at it for measurement's sake. So again, I don't like sticking to, or I don't like overly emphasizing measurements, but in general there are some nice like proportional things. Very, very general here, but our like palm is close to equal to the finger length, our palm is kind of almost square, you know, it's close, it's not exact. But this kind of like palm measurement, you can actually place and find in a lot of other spots. So thinking about that kind of unit of measurement, this to this to this to that to what, you know. So the nice thing about our hands is we have them and we can actually look at them and think about these things. So measurements. Then probably one of the last things, and again, everything I draw, I'm actually not switching gears in terms of like, now I'm drawing the hand, I have to approach it in this totally different way. I approach every part of the body from a big picture shape breakdown of broad to specific information. So when I'm blocking out the hand, it's the same process of the big information, shadow shapes, and then working into smaller and smaller information. That being said, we have more useful landmarks with our hands. So we have, you know, our knuckles going this way. I like to think about this. I like to think about kind of these knuckles. And then, you know, these kind of angles here. So all of our knuckle breakdowns, less how they're kind of less about their location in regards to previous knuckles on the same digits, and more about how they're kind of relating to the same knuckle on a different digit. So this kind of relationship over that one. And then the last thing I think about is, hold on, so let me write knuckles. The last thing I think about here is just a general taper that's happening. All of these things are tapering down from this kind of widest point down, down, down. So even in the big picture, it's tapering down like this, but on a much smaller picture, it's tapering down. Our fingers are tapering down. There's a general kind of taper that is happening here. So that's, you know, that will also help alleviate some of this kind of effect. So we're going for more of a kind of general taper of the finger, which then we can think about our knuckles like that. So taper. Hands. Less is more when you're drawing hands. Try to describe and state the gesture or the impact, the visual impact of that hand with as little information as possible. If you look at a lot of master drawings or master paintings also, from anyone, you know, I think Sargent is a great example. If you look at the hands he draws, it's like a few brush strokes. He's not going in and he's not defining this knuckle from that knuckle from the fingernail. It's very little information, very gestural and in the right proportion. Overdeveloping a hand can often kind of make a drawing worse. Not all the time, but often I see that. And then the last thing, actually, and this is going to go in the avoid list here, is avoid fingernails unless absolutely necessary. So that's another thing that it's so easy to snap to a kind of what we know rather than what we see when we're drawing. So drawing more symbolically is drawing what we know instead of drawing what we see. So, you know, we draw this very, very simple kind of fingernail, right? In relation to this knuckle here that kind of looks like this. So that kind of information, especially with hands, it's really easy to fall into that because it's a lot of really small decisions. It's a lot of work. It's pretty overwhelming. But if you just kind of approach it big picture and just stop it as soon as it looks like it's starting to read as it should. So less is more. Don't draw fingernails. Those are the last two. I guess along the lines of less is more is I always try to clump things together first, like into as big of, with the fingers especially. Try to group your fingers in a way. Really look for that with the models posing. If the fingers are like this, then don't make the fingers like this. Make it kind of one big shape, then a finger, and then a thumb. The initial kind of block ends of a hand, and often an okay place to leave it if you don't have a lot of time to develop it and you find that you're kind of rushing through the drawing, is just to leave it more as a mitten. So you have a thumb and then you have this kind of mass here. Typically I'll kind of figure out where the knuckles are and then this general shape, whether that's like this, you know, so but big picture kind of block in, outline, almost envelope ideas here. So those are what I think about. So those are what I'm thinking about when I'm drawing the hand. I'm avoiding finger contours. I'm avoiding knuckles that look like sausage links. I'm avoiding fingernails unless I absolutely have to. I am thinking about the 2x4 wrist connection of the hand. I'm thinking about the planes of the hand, the top, side, front, etc. Thinking about general measurements, but again, those will fall apart in any sort of kind of foreshortened perspective. I'm thinking about the knuckle lines here. Thinking about the overall taper of the hand, like coming out to here and then tapering in, tapering of the fingers too. Less is more. Big picture information. If that's enough, then I would just leave it there and then start with the mitten. So that's just to reiterate everything. Another kind of just fun fact that I like to use, I mean, it doesn't really relate to anything useful, but it's kind of cool. So our arms are interesting skeletally because we have one bone here, we have two bones here. Our first kind of group of all the bones in our hands is 3, and then 4, and then we have our 5s. So it's a cool like 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 all the way out, and at the same time it's tapering down. So just a fun fact on that one. Okay, so let's get into drawing some of these hands. This first one that I'm going to do is from the reference image hand 6 is the file name. So there's 2 hands here. I'm going to start with the upper hand. So again, initially just thinking gesture. Thinking about kind of this arc that's happening, and it's getting steeper and steeper. Hands are interesting because when they're in like a resting position, there's often a nice kind of curve to everything. So, and I don't, like if my hand's totally relaxed, there's this nice arc that's happening. So that's something I'm going to try to emphasize. So let's get this wrist kind of connection. Not sure exactly where that's going to be, but just thinking about that rectangle. Okay. Now thinking about some knuckle relationship here. So this is kind of the beginning of the thumb with that first knuckle, and I want to relate it to this knuckle. Now I'm kind of using this little circle motion here to describe that volume, but I'm not going to be putting in that kind of, that's where you start to think more about what you know and less what you're seeing. So this is me saying that there's a volume here, but I'm not really talking about it yet. Now with the knuckles, there's often, depending on the angle, there's kind of a two angles that we can break down the top plane of the hand into. You know, it's like from this knuckle to this knuckle, and then typically at a different angle or a different plane from the middle knuckle to the down to the pinky. So there's kind of this arc that's happening, and I'm thinking about that a little bit. I'm using my bony landmarks here as a general kind of guide for the knuckles. There's this big old kind of muscular pad muscle right here. You can kind of see it right here. And that's kind of the webbing between, you know, this knuckle is the base of the hand, and that's relating to this kind of knuckle and the thumb that's way in here, but it's almost like kind of drowned out by this muscle. Alright, now we can use this knuckle to kind of find the tip of the thumb. Again, just thinking about this overall kind of taper that's happening here. And I want to average, again, less is more, so when you think about our fingers kind of where they're curving and how they're curving, you think about, you know, all of these different angles. But really, if you can try to, you know, depending on how slight or severe that actual bend of the digit is, those angles are typically more easily and successfully depicted through less emphasis on the changes between the angles. So If it's really subtle, I would just almost turn it into a nice little arc here. Okay, so I'm getting to a place where I think I just need to start, or I would like to start mapping in shadow information. I actually don't want the hand to read too much like a hand. For me, if that happens too early on, I know that I've jumped a little bit too far into specifics too quickly. It really needs to read pretty abstractly in big shapes first. So I'm going to triangulate here where the end of the start of that curve is. Now I want to put in some shadow shape information here. Now I'm actually not getting too specific about this. You can really kind of zoom in and get all of the angle changes within this. But at this stage, this is enough to get started. Okay, this shadow shape here is nice because it's helping me see the different planes of the fingers. So this is the top plane, and then it drops onto this side plane here. And that carries out throughout, but only visually does it really make an impact at that point. Notice I haven't really mapped out any of the end of the fingers here, just a general kind of, this is about where that's going to stop. I'm going to actually grab a brush or a paper towel. I'll do this often with my drawings to push that information back so it's still there, but it's way less visually impactful, so I can draw over it and make the corrections that I feel I need to make. Adding in some more volumes here. Okay, I'm actually going to zoom up a little bit so So I can get a little more specific. Now there's a lot of, the top kind of part of this hand is falling into halftones, so this area is a little bit unclear as to what's shadow and what's light, but just try to just think about the light that we have here coming like this, and thinking about these not in light and this kind of catching half light. Okay, this is important where this is the less is more area, so once I zoom in I can actually see these separations between the fingers, but it's really understated, so I might put them in just in terms of their usefulness constructing, but I don't think that they're very important visually for the drawing. I'm going to leave them out as much as I can. Once again, I'm going to push all of this back into this half light. Thinking about how this is carrying up. Let's reinstate some things here. Okay, so I'm going to drop a whole veil of values down on this. Now because I kind of mapped in this shadow stuff earlier, it's not going to be one thin wash over everything. Is actually going to push everything back, so the shadows will still stay separated from the lights, but everything's going to get knocked back just a little. Bring this thumb in a little bit more. Start to think about that fingernail, right? That's showing us a front plane of the hand, but I'm not gonna focus too much on it other than that for a while. So the reason I wanted a thin veil over all of this, and I'm still not thinking in terms of value, it's still just shadow shapes from, separating the light from the shadow. But this is going to allow me to then add just one extra bit of development, which would be the more of the highlights. But for now, I'm still kind of reinstating some of the structural bits here. Make sure that there is still just an overall taper even within the fingers and within the whole mass, so I'm kind of going back through and reinforcing the taper. Still trying to be as smooth and quiet with the noise of the shadow information. So you can hopefully tell that I do have okay, sorry, move the camera so you can get a little bit more up close with this. I'm trying to still be as kind of smooth as possible when I'm laying in these values. As you can see, I'm bridging all of this. I've kind of stated some of the boundaries of the fingers here, but as I don't think it's a very important visual event, I am massing this all in together. I'm not kind of massing in each finger individually. It's just one big shadow shape that I'm treating. I also find that if I can't get my kind of massing in of tone to be very smooth off the first pass, all I do is I just, if this is my first pass, I just will hatch multiple times in as many directions as it takes. To kind of get a smoother and smoother transition. Now I'm not adding any pressure, so it does get a little bit darker as it goes, but it's still just trying to get a nice, even, quiet transition. So now I'm just reinforcing some of my shadow shapes. making sure that this is tapering still. And so this kind of lighter value mass that I'm doing here is still kind of noisy. And the only reason I'm massing this in is so that I can pull out some of the highlights. So, for instance, still thinking more in terms of, you know, this is still a block-in phase for me. But I'm getting a little more, if this was on toned paper, I would be using white chalk to get this part. And then we can clean up the edges a little bit if we want. Yeah, so that's probably where I would leave that hand. There, I think there's some issues up here with the wrist connection. But as a hand study, I think that's pretty good. I've practiced a lot of restraint with the fingers, and that's the most important thing to take from this. Okay, let's look at the second hand on this same reference image. Okay, I'm going to try to place it here. Hopefully that will stay on camera. So again, starting with my wrist connection here, thinking about what planes I'm seeing. And then basic gesture. Again, finding that this bony landmark here, yeah, the ulna here, that's a nice landmark that I can actually triangulate off of. So thinking about the thumb. So really important not to rush this. You can use that same landmark to find the tip of the thumb. I'm just going to say roughly that's about there. Anytime you have, like for instance, his thumb is interacting with the thigh here, that's good context to have. It's use any visual information to your advantage. Thinking about the first row of knuckles here. So it's all just a kind of a strategy game of what's going to work. Each hand is going to be different in terms of what works best, but I always just try to map out the knuckles. Knuckles, thinking about this as the mitten idea. Not only the mitten idea, but there's this general kind of tapering inward of the hands, and then we can reinforce that with the tapering in of the fingers. Also remembering that I'm not ever tied to any of the marks that I'm making. All of these are just like a little kind of spot that I'm exploring, and then I can kind of like come back and reassess later. Okay, so as it hits this second row of knuckles, I'm going to triangulate that to this point. Again, that's pretty good. Now this kind of comes down like this to that middle knuckle, and then it's a little bit more, not quite that much, but a little bit more drastic of an angle. So again, that middle finger is where there's typically a lot of angle changes happening from this, from those two to those two, same out here. So keep that in mind. You can even think a little bit about do these knuckles relate to each other? I'm going to triangulate again from the pinky, end of the pinky, to this point here. So we can try to find that kind of end of that one. That pinky goes, the knee kind of is interacting with that, so put that knee shape in there. Then from the pinky out, maybe around in here. It's pretty close. Again, trying to think of this taper. At this point, that's a little bit too much too far along. Come to this side again. So this is me just taking a stab at how thick that finger is, and then I'm going to start to relate it. Again, I'm not tied to any of these lines, as long as I keep them light. So that's kind of going to be the end of the last, or the middle finger. But let's use the pinky again. Okay, so this is when I'm thinking a little bit about, you know, the front plane between the fingers. You can see it, you can see kind of where this black, kind of darker shadow shape between the fingers starts. Way up here. And then where it ends, which is right around here. So what we're really seeing there is that kind of front plane between the fingers. There's a little bit outcrop here for this knuckle. Now for all of these knuckles, and I should have done this earlier, I'm going to throw all of this down into a shadow. And I know that there are some spots catching half light, but for the sake of simplicity, I want to make, you know, if I really squint down on that, all of this is falling into shadow. I can pull out the lighter, the little spots that are catching the light as I develop further, but this is the biggest picture information I can go for right now. So I want to think about the wrist a little bit here. Because I want that piece to still read. Okay. I'll start to subdivide a little bit here. Again, first thinking about less information. Knuckle, knuckle, knuckle. So this is going to come down a little bit. less information and building up into more information. Once again, the taper being the most important thing that I'm thinking about as I'm kind of pulling out all of the fingers here. Wash this down. Okay, I want to catch the thumb up. And then we can go in, I'm going to go in a little bit further here, thinking about the planes again, side planes of the fingers. A little more specificity. So with just like anything, when there is foreshortening, it will kind of tells your brain like that's not right. But just try to be faithful to your measurements and to what your eye is seeing until you have everything down, and then you can make a judgment on if that reads well or not. Hands, feet, some of these more kind of ever-changing forms. There's often times that they don't look right even as you're doing everything right. So just stay patient with it. It typically all comes together in the end. Again, I'm ignoring nails. One thing you can do with the fingernails is, since I kind of washed this out, is just pull those out if you really feel the urge to. I don't think they're that necessary yet. They become necessary, but for what we're doing and just getting basic proportions and stuff, it's not important. The details aren't important until your proportions are accurate. I might even change this whole wrist. Okay, so that's another one. I'll do a couple more of these. Alright, so let's get into this next reference image, hand 2. And this one's more of a closed kind of fist, so let's see how we approach that. First, just getting the big envelope shape. I'm kind of thinking about where those knuckles end by triangulating it from this knuckle down. So again, just thinking about the planes right now. this side plane here of the kind of shows you this fat pad here. Maybe this is easier. So I'm trying to express this side plane here, and it comes all the way, you know, it wraps into the side plane of the pinky as it's curling in. So that's this. We're seeing the side plane of the wrist here, and that kind of dropping like so. So with the palm side of the hand, we have two kind of main volumes, and it's this kind of pad here and then this pad here of the thumb. So what I'm seeing is the pad of the pinky is right here, and then the thumb pad is right here, and then there's this little kind of flatter spot in between, and that's where all our tendons are coming in. More specific with this now. so the model has really long nails, and this one, so it's kind of hard to avoid that. I'm trying to plot out the shape of the thumbnail there. You can already see it's detracting from the overall kind of hand shape. So I'm going to put that in there because I think we need that relationship. But again, like even at this early stage when I'm starting to map out, if I need to, the fingernails, in my opinion, it's already starting to be like too much information there. I'm going to stop there and see if I can get away with just maybe leaving it like that. We'll see. Same with this nail. So once I start to divide the fingers, I'm just thinking about, what's the width of this compared to this one, compared to this one, compared to this one. This one is the kind of thickest one that I'm seeing. So just keeping all those kind of talking to each other. Does it taper in more at this end? Does it get wider up here? Just all those little things. So I'm still not thinking of this as really mapping out the fingers as much as it is looking at more specific line information and angle information. Okay, now we can come into this shadow shape idea here. I'm trying to kind of map out this last pinky by finding this darker shadow shape here. This one might be another one that's worth a larger overall wash, and then we can just lightly pull out the highlights. Okay, so you see a wash like this, still, I dropped this value quite a bit, but there's still a separation between the light side and the shadow side. You can beef that up if you want to, but as long as we're not losing sight of those different value families. Okay, last little pass, refining pass here. Felt a little bit too big. Really trying to think about these overlapping forms, how this kind of fat pad of the hand overlaps and then the wrist kind of comes out. So now I'm just emphasizing a few of the darker spots within this lock-in. So some of the darker kind of accents between the fingers. Kind of this underplane of the fat pad on the pinky side. I try to emphasize that a little bit. Okay, now let's pull the lights out. Really look for where those lights are. They're never, almost never kind of on an edge. They're always somewhere in the middle. Okay. So there's a fist. A few things that I want to change here. So notice all the broken forms and the loss of information that you're seeing up here and down in this area, yet it still has the impact, the visual impact of a hand. So you don't need to hit the viewers over the head with information. It's often a better idea to leave some things unsaid. Another thing to consider with these is we're drawing them from up close, we're like 10 feet away, 10 inches away, or a foot away, but we need to make sure that this reads from further back. So typically something like this is going to read better from further back, which gives it more of an interest from a distance, and then when you're up close, there's more of an interest in it at this stage also, because you're kind of like surprised that all of this kind of loose information actually reads really well. So keeping it interesting for multiple distances is important. Okay, now let's look at this foreshortened hand on reference hand 4. Okay, so for this one, super foreshortened shadow shapes are going to be the most useful, as well as triangulating and just shape kind of big picture stuff. So let's go for it. I'm just thinking about this kind of the angle of the wrist coming into the hand, and then I'm going to go straight into getting this angle of our knuckles. Pinky comes out a little bit. This is the overall kind of tilt of the index finger. And I placed that initially pretty arbitrary on this because we don't have our width, our scale kind of locked in based on this width. I'm gonna use this to start to reference that. So now we can use kind of this point. This line really represents more of the core shadow line of the index finger is what I'm seeing. Okay. Now this point is kind of where the knuckles, where the pinky overlaps the knuckles, so that's, I think, a good spot. Going to be in that area. I'm not going to concern myself too much with that. Let's come up to this other side. So if I draw that, if I kind of follow this angle of the knuckles through, just carry it through, I'm seeing that it lines up pretty close to where the wrist kind of emanates from the thumb. It's not perfect, but it's close. Okay. Now let's get a little more specific with our knuckles. Trying to find our wrist or our thumb location here. Maybe line that up with the ring finger. It seems pretty close. If this is kind of the point of the ring finger, or wait, that's the point of the middle finger. That's what I meant. Ring finger's here, pinky here, index here. So again, you see how I'm just using basic lines straight through, kind of ghosty bandy lines here. Some kind of pulling through to show the underplane of the palm, and it kind of emanates out of in between all the fingers. Pinky. That feels pretty good. So again, I'm trying to, by drawing through the form, I can, typically you can find something to anchor into and lock. So if you're ever kind of hit a spot where you're like, I don't know what to do next, zoom out and think about like, oh, maybe this, for this particular case, this line, if I drew through it, aligned with kind of this angle change here, where the wrist comes into the hand. So instead of just saying, I don't know how thick this is, you can a lot of times draw what you need to draw by drawing its surroundings, or just trying to approach it from a different angle. So if I need to map out this finger, maybe it's not as important for me to kind of map it out in this linear way of just following this around and then coming up. Maybe it's better if you get stuck to approach it from maybe drawing this finger next, and that will help resolve what's happening here. Okay, and then between these two things, we can actually even use cast shadows and shadow shapes. So I want to just bring this thumb a little bit further along. Maybe two about there. Push it back a little bit. Now let's jump into shadow shapes. You really gotta stay patient with yourself with these. Trust your eyes, trust your measurements, and really try to work on not snapping into drawing what you know, especially with foreshortened views. I'm going to keep this one really broad as it comes up here. There is a little shift. Okay, so you see what I just did there, mapping out the shadow shape of this, brings me into finding the other side, the contour of this finger in the light. And if I'm not ready to make a decision on that kind of contour, typically that's a good way to switch gears and keep working slowly and based on just our visual information. Because the second I put this in, by just knowing like, hey, I need another side of this finger to make that look like a finger, then we're drawing what we know and not what we see. So I waited for that until I could be sure, based on the shadow information. even still, I'm not 100% on this. I think it's going to be somewhere in there. Again, our darkest dark, so in this case we can see some of that that plane between the fingers. It's all dark information, so it's not a huge concern, but you can see where the actual palm of the hand is and where these fingers kind of enter into the main mass here is a little bit higher. So from here to here is that front plane. So both of these fingers feel a little wide to me, but I'm not going to panic about that yet. I'm going to come back around to it. And maybe I'm just going to bring in all of this information. So let's do that. Let's bring this stuff in a little bit. So already all those proportions are starting to fit a little bit better. Just the width of the wrist feels a lot nicer. Okay, so this next shadow is going to emanate right around there. Okay, I'm going to mask these in and then double check some proportions. In fact, in this case, I'm also going to really push the darkest darks. Brush it all back a little. Okay, and then let's emphasize some of the drawing. Again, I'm not even going to be putting in fingernails. I don't think that that is something that we need to focus on for these. I'm going to try to slim down this finger. I think it's a little big. Still maintaining a gradual taper. Sometimes, like for this one, you can actually map out your finger by really looking closely at that shadow, or your fingernail by really looking closely at that shadow shape. So once you have that indicated, you know your brain is going to fill in the rest. Sure. Another thing to start thinking about is here on this side of the finger, this is in the light side and it's against the white of the thigh. Now there is a value difference there, but I don't want to go in and put as hard of a line as this over here because this is light next to light. So a line, if at all, should be a lighter line. Okay, I think that's it for this one. That was like maybe 30 minutes I think I spent on it. So these block-ins can go a little bit longer than a usual kind of 5, 10, 20 minute thing. Take your time on them. Still, just thinking about the same things that we've been concerned with this whole term. Big shapes, abstracting the form, drawing what we see and not what we know. Thank you.